name is Ruth McElroy, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Centre for Gender Studies in Wales, which was founded, of course, by Ursula and was then developed as well with Jane Aaron, who's hiding somewhere in the back over there. And we're thrilled to see so many of you here again this year. It really is fantastic. It's a great testament, I think, to Ursula's work in a whole range of different ways, her work in education, her work for women's history, but her work on history in Wales as well. And it's great to see that this event continues from year to year to still be so well supported. And on this International Women's Day, I was thinking that when I was about to offer to help fix the lift, it's a particular pleasure to say thank you to Archif Menywod Cymru, to the Welsh Women's Archive, for their kind support for the lecture, which is greatly appreciated, together with the sponsorship from New Law, the legal practice where Helen Molyneux, Ursula's niece, now practices. And Helen will be saying a few words at the end of the lecture, giving a vote of thanks. I'd like also to thank University of Wales Press here and to Honor for sending some books for us to look at. It's great to see the work of so many women academics being appreciated, being read, and perhaps most importantly being bought as well. I'd also like to thank Dr. Hugh Jones at the back there, who is taking a photograph of us all as we speak, but who this year as last has been incredibly helpful in keeping all of this show on the road, so thank you to you, Hugh. I'm going to hand over now to Fiona Reid, who is going to introduce this evening's lecture.
Okay, and like Ruth, I'm delighted to see so many people here, and like many people here, I can hardly believe that this is actually the fifth Ursula Masson lecture. The years have gone very, very rapidly, and in some ways they've also gone very, very slowly, and I'm just very pleased so many people are here tonight to just remember Ursula and to think about the sort of work that she did and also the sort of colleague she was. So I'm genuinely delighted that so many people are here, and genuinely delighted, of course, that Karen Hunt is here. Karen Hunt is Professor of Modern British History at Keele University, and as I'm sure everyone knows, she has published widely on many aspects of women's politics, and she has written on the gendering of politics from the 1880s to the 1930s, including Equivocal Feminists and also Socialist Women, with June Hannam, who is also here and was also a dear friend and colleague of Ursula's. Now, Karen works very hard exploring the life and politics of Dora Montefiore, but she has a series of connected projects on aspects of everyday women's life and everyday women's politics. And I can't possibly give you the whole range of Karen's interests because we would simply be here all night. I mean, Karen works on a really wide, diverse range of topics, including assessing the effect of women's enfranchisement on interwar local politics and looking at the politics of food on the First World War home front. And just to give you some sense of the range of Karen's work, I'm just going to give you a few titles from some recent essays. The Politics of Food and Women's Neighbourhood Activism in First World War Britain, Foiled Through the World, the Role of Travel in the Making of Dora Montefiore, Women's Solidarity in the 1930 Dublin Lockout, Dora Montefiore and the Save the Kiddies scheme. And tied in with all of that is, of course, politics and the everyday life, and the lecture this evening is entitled Only Connect, Women's Politics and the Everyday Between the Wars. And Karen is very happy to take questions afterwards. So welcome, Karen. It's very nice to have you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I was and am really touched to be asked. I knew Ursula and her work, although not as well as some of you here. I co-edited a special edition of Women's History Review on Borders and Frontiers in Women's History, in which her article on party politics and votes for women in Wales, 1912 to 15, appeared in 2000. And we used to meet at conferences, and we tilled really rather similar furrows in women's history, both fascinated by political women and the ways in which they responded to formal politics, and sought ways to create their own women's politics. And I last saw her at June Hannam's inaugural professorial lecture, and I suppose I still feel I'm in dialogue with her, and my students are encouraged to read her work. It's just that her replies are becoming a little more faint. So, I want to talk today. Part of my theme is making connections, and I thought I'd start by just saying a little bit about connections, and in particular connections with Ursula. So although the lecture is about connections, and although this is at a distance, there are more connections in Ursula and my histories than I actually realised. I take the shared interest in the history of women's politics and history making as a political act, and even the need to connect with experiences and excite an interest well beyond the academy. I take those as read, as connections that we both had. What I hadn't realised was that we had both worked in adult education, which has been the cradle of so much women's history, and that Ursula had an MA from the university that I now work at, and indeed I was reminded of that this evening. So when I found that out, I went to find her file, because when you find someone's file, you learn something. And reading her file, Ursula studied for a Victorian Studies MA at Keele between 1972 and 1975. And in some ways, reading the file is a study perhaps in becoming a feminist historian. I certainly found quite a few connections with my own experience, and I'll just mention perhaps a little. She chose to do an essay on working women in the first half of the 20th century. So there was an opportunity, perhaps not a very big one, but there was an opportunity to study women. But she also perhaps had to do an essay on John Stuart Mill, his view on the perfectibility of man. And I guess it was about the perfectibility of men. For the first essay, the one on women, the internal examiner wrote, "Another women's lib tract. I should say I do not encourage these. I suppose they are written for my education." Some of you around the room may remember these sorts of things. The external examiner said, "I found it rather hard to keep up my interest in what is offered." So, that tells you an awful lot about them rather than us. A year later, her dissertation on the development of the Irish and Roman Catholic communities of Merthyr Tydfil and Dalai in the 19th century, the first marker grumbles about the effect of Ursula's first degree in English and philosophy, that her, quote, "writing is rather imprecise and more than a little careless." But then you look to what clearly is the new external examiner, who I think probably was a woman, and she says rather differently, "I was impressed by the energy and enthusiasm shown in this piece of work, and the quality of much of the research." I also, when I looked through the file, noticed that the male tutors can't type. Their responses to Ursula's letters are in notes appended to the back of what the secretary has then typed for them. So, finally, the conclusion to there are various discussions between Ursula and her tutor as to what she's going to do after she finishes the MA, and she is unsuccessfully trying to get a job. And that also says rather a lot about the context of being a woman in the 1970s in a university. The file always talks about her as Mrs. Masson. Ursula wrote in a letter to her tutor, "I'm afraid that careers seem closed to me at present. Not an offer did I get, apart from a week's sorting at the post office. Anyway, I'm to be a mother in June next year, so it's taken out of my hands for some time at least." And her male tutor replied, "I'm sorry that nobody has so far made you an offer of employment. I thought that I was saying kind and flattering things, but evidently they were not kind and flattering enough. However, I am delighted with your other news, and that should in fact afford more than a career." So there you are. So with all those kind of connections with, I think, not just my experience, but many experiences here in the room, let me move on to what I am going to talk about today, which is Only Connect, women's politics and the everyday between the wars. Well, some of you may recognise E.M. Forster's famous instruction or aspiration, only connect. It comes from his novel, Howard's End, and interestingly, he continues a line or so later to say, live in fragments no longer. And it's these two phrases that I want to use, because I think this captures rather well the approach I want to take in this lecture, and which I want to suggest is the best way to think about women and local activism after the vote was won. I expect many of you know a great deal about aspects of this, about particular places, particular organisations, and particular women. So what I want to do today is to set out a broad approach to the topic that June Hannam over there and I have been developing for some time, and to expand on that to consider a particular connection, that between women's politics and the everyday. Overall, my purpose is to suggest that our historical understanding of women's politics, in this case locally and in the interwar period, should live in fragments no longer. Now, my local examples are, I think, perhaps unsurprising to you. You can hear my accent, which is not Welsh. My local examples are largely drawn from interwar Manchester, but I think you will find resonances in them. In 1918, the Manchester Guardian greeted the passing of the Representation of the People Act by identifying its wider significance for women and for the country. Measured by purely political results, it may prove to be of less effect than either its friends or its opponents anticipated. Though in certain directions, and particularly on all that concerns the position and interest of women before the law and in the state, it is bound to tell, and in time to tell heavily. But beyond that, it will modify the whole attitude and outlook of women in society. It will, in a real sense, bring spiritual as well as political emancipation. Women will realise themselves a little differently and will be differently regarded by others. So said the Manchester Guardian. Well, had the euphoria of the moment led the Guardian to overstate the impact that women's enfranchisement would have on women and on politics? Well, of course, in 1918, the vote had only been granted to some women, those who were at least 30 years old and who were local government electors, or who were married to local government electors. Still, the numbers are striking. Nearly 8.5 million women in Britain could now vote, as against 13 million men. That is all men over the age of 21, plus younger men who had served at the front. As a result of this, women constituted 39.6% of the electorate. As importantly, the Act also increased the number of women local government electors from 1 to 8.5 million. Now, once women had achieved enfranchisement in 1918, contemporaries expected that politics would be different. Millicent Fawcett, who was leader of the suffragist National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, reflected in 1919. Our 50 years struggle for the women's vote was not actuated by our setting any extraordinary value on the mere power of making a mark on a voting paper once every 3 or 4 years. We did not accept as a symbol of free citizenship, valuable as a thing good in itself, but for the sake of the larger, enlarged opportunities, the improved status of women, which we knew it involved. We worked for it with ardour and passion, because it would benefit not women only, but the whole community. It was the cause of men, women, and children. Now, winning the principle that sex no longer disqualified women from formal political citizenship was bound to change the nature and practice of politics. But it was not entirely clear what the shape of that politics was going to be. From the beginning, there was a lively debate, especially within women's and feminist organisations, about what citizenship meant to women, and on what basis they should participate in political life. Historians have also shown an interest in these issues, exploring women's role in political organisations, how far they sought to improve their position as women, and their ability to exert an influence on policy making. Now, my intention here is not simply to add another layer to that historical narrative, but to propose what June Hannam and I call an archaeology of women's politics. And here's a picture to bring home to you. Archaeology of women's politics. So this poses a challenge, not only to how we explain what happened after the vote was won, but also how we conceive of politics more generally. So instead of focusing on the national, by what I mean by the national parties, MPs, national women's organisations and other pressure groups, as well as the national press. So instead of focusing on that, the way I think to gain a better understanding of the impact of women's enfranchisement across the country as a whole is to explore how women understood and actually did their politics at a local level. By turning to the locality, the space in which everyday politics was experienced, it becomes possible to raise new questions that can lead to the reframing of interwar women's politics. By exploring the interrelationship between the changing possibilities of women's politics and situating this not only within the swift-moving politics of the time, but also local political cultures and histories of women's neighbourhood activism, we can begin to achieve a more nuanced picture of the aftermath of suffrage. To the rich mix of what we already know about separate elements of interwar women's politics, I want to find a way to add the local and the everyday. Now, this has not been the focus to date. For the most part, research has concentrated on particular organisations, whether mixed sex or single sex, thereby compartmentalising women's political activism. Or a biographical approach has been taken, where individual lives are used as a way to map continuities and discontinuities between women's political activism before and after suffrage. So why turn to the local and the everyday? Well, it was at the level of the local that the relationship between different groups and also between the activist and her newly enfranchised, unorganised sister can be best pursued through what one might call a fingertip search of the spaces in which women carried out and developed their politics. After all, it is locally that the majority of women, and indeed men, engaged in or encountered politics. It was here that they attended meetings, they organised political and social events, and they carried out the patient electoral work of canvassing door to door. In the 1920s and 1930s, this was recognised by all the political parties who made a greater effort to build up a grassroots membership and to engage with this new electorate. Now, work has already begun in mapping interwar women's politics within some localities. And Ursula, of course, was studying a particular locality, but not this period particularly. This shows the variety of groups in which women were active, and that counter to what has often been assumed, feminist issues had actually not disappeared after the First World War. There is also a wealth of research on women and Labour politics in the interwar years. For example, showing how Labour women in South Wales worked alongside men in pushing for health and maternity reforms in the 1930s, issues that were seen as integral to Labour Party values and appeal in the period. The extent to which political organisations informed and were informed by everyday life has often been explored by me a little in relation to Manchester and by Anne-Marie Hughes for Scotland. Indeed, she suggests that it was working class women's experiences of everyday life that actually politicised them. Nonetheless, these studies still tend to compartmentalise women into specific organisations or groups of organisations, and while raising questions about everyday life, as some do, they don't take this further to explore whether a different kind of politics was being developed across and between and even beyond parties and women's organisations. Now this changes the terrain of investigation to what I call women's politics. The traditional study of women's activism almost invariably focuses on single discrete organisations, such as a specific political party, or just on suffragism or on the women's movement, as if political organisations operated in parallel with one another. Too often there is a presumption that party and pressure group politics don't shape one another or influence how women chose to express themselves politically. It's in contrast to this that the notion of women's politics captures the range of spaces in which not just women generally, but an individual woman might take political action. Now this includes not only formal politics, parties and pressure groups, but also informal politics, participating in civil society more broadly conceived. Examples might be tenants' associations or consumer boycotts. We cannot, for example, really understand party activism unless we place it into a context of the other possibilities for political action within a community or neighbourhood, and consider the extent to which party membership is distinct from or integral to these other forms of activism. For the new women citizens of the interwar years, there were actually many possibilities. A woman could join a mixed-sex political party, such as the Liberals, the Conservatives, Labour, the Communist Party, or the Independent Labour Party. They could join a feminist organisation, such as the Open Door Council, the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship, or the 6 Point Group. They could join a non-party women's political organisation, like the Women's Citizen Association or the Women's Cooperative Guild. They could join a non-political women's organisation, like the Women's Institute, as well as a whole raft of pressure groups and campaigns. An example would be the Workers' Birth Control Group. So to understand the meaning and possibilities presented by one form of membership, I think it needs to be placed beside the other memberships held by an individual. Individuals very rarely are just members of one thing. Then it would be possible to explore connections between individuals and how these connections, as friends or working colleagues or even as uncomfortable allies, affected their developing politics as well as the resulting networks between organisations. Hence this idea of connections. The breadth and the deep roots of women's politics can be seen by looking at a couple of examples of women who were active in interwar Manchester. And I think this will illustrate what I mean. And one example is Annot Robinson. Here's Annot Robinson. Before the war, she was active in the ILP, the Women's Social and Political Union, the suffragettes, the Manchester Women's Suffrage Society, and she was a paid organiser for the Women's Labour League and for the NUWSS's Electoral Fighting Fund. During the war, she continued to be active, particularly in her local community of Ancoats. The war, her opposition to it, and her concern to ameliorate its effect on women reconfigured her activism. She was part of the local Women's War Interest Committee, and she was a galvaniser of the local contribution to the Women's Peace Crusade. But she was also president of her local branch of the Independent Labour Party. She sat on the Trades Council and on the city's Food Control Committee. Her focus was local rather than national, and she acted as a bridge between a number of different organisations, both women's organisations and mixed-sex organisations. She was one link in a network of women in Manchester for whom the war acted as a catalyst in their woman-focused politics. After 1918, her activism continued. It focused on peace through the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. This is one of those kind of team photographs of a delegation to the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom's first conference after the war. She remained active in the Independent Labour Party and stood unsuccessfully for the City Council, finding it hard to be selected by Labour to fight a winnable seat. She was forced to leave Manchester in 1923 in pursuit of paid work to support herself and her children. More briefly, other Manchester women had multiple affiliations and interests in the interwar period. For example, Dora Taylor was a Labour Manchester City Councillor between 1925 and 31. She was active in her local ILP branch. She was the first national women's organiser of the Cooperative Party. She was National Secretary of the Home Help Society. She was on the executive of the Manchester National Council of Women, and she was a member of Crompsall Women's Citizens Association. A long list. But then Nellie Westcott, who was a Conservative Manchester City Councillor from 1930 to 36, was chairman of her local Women's Conservative Unionist Association. She was involved in a number of industrial schools, as well as the Sunshine Home for Poor Children. Sarah Lasky, a Liberal City Councillor from 29 to 42, was chairman of the Liberal Women's Central Council, as well as being active in the Jewish Ladies Visiting Society, the Manchester and Salford Council for Social Service, and the Council for the Unmarried Mother. Now, these are clearly examples of energetic women with relatively high public profiles. Plotting out the multiple affiliations and trajectories of activism of less well-known women is challenging, but it's not impossible, and it's certainly crucial to conducting an archaeology of interwar women's politics. What is particularly interesting when biographical profiles are reconstructed for local women activists are the numbers of women who were active both in party and in non-party women's organisations, despite the fact that political parties discouraged what they saw as disloyalty. The Labour Party made this particularly clear. In 1920, Labour women were urged, quote, to avoid dissipating their energies in non-party political organisations. Basically, they were being told not to be involved in the women's movement. Their national women's officer warned women that by joining such groups, they would be in danger of getting their political opinions muddled. Women should not be distracted. Instead, they should give their energies to the Labour Party, quote, to keep it right on questions that affect women and children. All the political parties wanted to recruit the new women's vote. It was addressed, cajoled, and sometimes feared as a homogenous entity. Women were assumed to be all the same. But as David Jarvis notes of the interwar Conservative Party, these are things for you to look at, so you don't have to look at me. It's important, he says, not to underestimate either the continuing hostility within the party to women workers or the growing concern about the wider implications of increased political activism. An important aspect of the context for women's relationship to politics in the interwar period was that political parties, wherever they were on the political spectrum, were suspicious of what they deemed to be feminism, i.e. women's desire to identify primarily with their sex rather than with their party or their class or whatever. So if we're going to understand women's politics in the interwar period, I think we have to take the following steps. We need to break free from parallel histories and look at the interrelationship between different forms of women's formal and informal political activity, both individually and collectively. And we need to ask whether political women of whatever affiliation actually had more in common with each other than those who were unaligned or indifferent. To do this, we need to really consider all the spaces in which women's politics could be made. This will enable us to acknowledge that women's political activity is dynamic. It can involve multiple affiliations and it can change over time. The most effective way to do this is, I think, to look at the locality. By refocusing on the local, we bring into sight not only the activist, but also her newly enfranchised but unorganised or unaffiliated sisters and the actual relationship between them. So how can we capture the breadth and depth of these experiences and the interrelationship between them? Well, that's where this idea of an archaeology of women's politics comes in. So what is it? And what is this? Why use this metaphor? Well, first, I think we've got to map the site. Yeah? Think archaeology. We've got to map the site, tracing the effect of enfranchisement on how women understood and did politics. But we also need to excavate what lies below the surface, to uncover how individual women made their political choices over a long period of time. Context tells us much. Politics was and is about the interaction between parties, pressure groups and civil society, as well as between the politically engaged and the ordinary citizen. Admitting women in some cases for the first time, or in far greater numbers than before, made a difference to the context of political life broadly conceived, as well as to women's experience of it. In order to develop a new understanding of the nature and meaning of women's politics, comparative local studies are crucial, because they make it possible to assess patterns of similarity and difference, and to trace continuities and discontinuities across time and between organisations. For example, it's important to recognise the ways in which earlier local political cultures created the possibilities for women to make their own political journeys, shape the networks between political women, and the choices made on whether to pursue a particular issue through mixed sex or feminist or women's organisations. All those choices have a prehistory, and we need to understand that. Women who sought election as local councillors, for example, made complex decisions about whether to stand as independent or party political candidates. And these decisions tended to be affected by the political context of the locality. In Manchester, the first woman elected to the City Council stood as an independent. The first woman to do this was Margaret Ashton, and here she is. She was elected in 1908, and she made this choice. She stood as an independent, even though she'd long been a member of the Liberal Party. She stood unsuccessfully as a Liberal candidate in 1907, but the following year she stood as an independent because she felt the Liberal Party were not going to give women the vote. However, after the war, the picture is rather different in terms of whether women choose to stand as independents. Although the non-party Women's Citizens Association attempted to win a seat on the council, party politics had already become dominant locally. So the Manchester and Salford Women's Citizens Association changed its tactics from putting forward their own candidate to supporting women candidates irrespective of their party affiliation, provided that they supported a slate of women's issues. The first women who were elected in Manchester on party tickets were Annie Lee and Mary Smith, and both of them were Labour Party women. Annie Lee was elected for Gorton South and Mary Smith for Beswick, and they were both elected in 1919. However, this picture was dependent on, who gets selected and how you decide to stand depended on local political cultures. And there are other examples that give a rather different picture. So, for example, of the 13 women elected to Cambridge City Council between 1918 and 1930, 10 of those women were independents. Over the same period, 18 women sat on Manchester City Council. 2 were elected pre-war as independents, and a further 2 were part of a local municipal progressive union. But the rest were either Liberals, Labour or Conservative. So you can see that party politics had become dominant already. Now both cities, both Manchester and Cambridge, had local women's citizens associations encouraging women to be active citizens, but they chose to take their journeys in different kinds of ways. And that's to do with local political cultures. Now these examples suggest that there were significant interrelationships between organisations at a local level that need to be contextualised. For instance, between this rather fascinating organisation, the Women's Citizens Association, which declared itself to be non-party, and women who were already in political parties, particularly women in Labour Party women's sections. At the 1920 Labour Women's Conference, when that resolution was debated, which instructed members to avoid dissipating their energies in non-party political organisations, a number of women at that time actually spoke up in favour of women's citizens' associations as an additional space in which Labour women could make their politics. And Manchester's Anna Robinson, who you saw earlier, drew on her own experience of socialist, suffrage and peace activism to argue women had for years been associated with other organisations and had obtained special knowledge therefrom, which had been of immense value. So how did these kind of relationships work on the ground? Well, despite the non-party position of WCAs, we know that Labour women were actually involved in local branches. In Manchester, Hannah Mitchell, whose principal loyalty in the 1920s was to the Independent Labour Party, she wrote for the local WCA's paper, Manchester and Salford Women's Citizen. And that newspaper was able to support Labour municipal candidates such as Ellen Wilkinson, who of course later was at this time still in Manchester, but was later to become a Labour MP and Cabinet Minister. And they supported Ellen Wilkinson because they understood her to be sympathetic to the Women's Citizens Association's agenda. Now these kinds of relationships are quite difficult, quite tricky, and they need to be plotted carefully throughout the interwar period, particularly because Labour women's sections become more insular and wary of interlopers as the period goes on. Crossing boundaries between organisations and sustaining multiple memberships actually becomes more difficult in the 1920s and as the 1920s wind on. Any mapping of interwar women's politics has to explore how this affected women in local communities, particularly their everyday experience of being a citizen and their attitude to politics. So it's now to the everyday that I want to turn. Comparative local studies allow us to consider the effect of the experience of everyday life, not just on the particular practice of political women, but also on the understanding of politics themselves. What did politics mean in everyday life? And could a politics be made which bore a closer relationship to the everyday experiences of unpoliticised women? Is this a way in which political women can connect with apparently unpolitical women? Well, one way in which organised women responded to the new possibilities of enfranchisement was to focus on educating women to make the best use of the vote. The idea was to bring knowledge of how local politics worked to women where they were going about their daily lives in local neighbourhoods. This was the focus of much of the women's citizenship education, which was delivered both by non-party organisations such as the WCAs, for whom this was their raison d'etre, and by the political parties which in their different ways courted the new woman voter in the 1920s. It was not unusual to hear the claim that, quote, the politics of a city council can truthfully be said to be the politics of the home, and the affairs of our city touch men, women and children in almost every act of their lives. Essentially, the local, the everyday and municipal affairs were inextricably bound together, at least according to those who were already active women citizens. There was, they argued, every reason for ordinary people to take an interest in and participate in local democracy. Yet at the same time, there remained a prejudice that women were innately parochial. Dorothy Jewson, later to briefly be a Labour MP, reflected in 1923. She said, "Our canvassers found very little sex prejudice, except among the class of women whose interests are bounded by the four walls of their house. Such women thought that women's place was the home, looking after her husband and children." Yet, as we're going to see, there were some women activists in the interwar period who not only argued against this view, but sought a way to connect the woman in the home with the political possibilities beyond it. Now, some played on this familiar observation. Writing in the newspaper of the northwest region of the ILP, a woman called Nancy Goslin observed in 1928, "Somebody once said, 'A woman's place is in the home.' I do not expect that it was a man who said it to a woman. It must have been said to another man. and very quietly. A woman's place is everywhere, and she has got to have everywhere fit to live in. Now, this argument is part of a strand of women's political activism that Sheila Rowbottom has recently explored, where some women in Britain and the United States in this period and in the preceding decades sought, she argues, to democratise daily life. She suggests that their efforts required a parallel project of redesigning democracy. Connecting formal politics with everyday life as experienced in local neighbourhoods was part of that project. And it's in this context that we should place Hannah Mitchell's stated ambition as a Labour councillor. It was to make a bridge between the women in the home and the public authority, and to interpret one to the other. Looking at the kind of meetings being held by women, particularly in the 1920s, one can see that Mitchell was not the only local councillor with such an ambition, and that indeed many women were hungry for this kind of information. So we find the new local Labour women councillors speaking to local women's cooperative guilds. Remind you of women's cooperative guilds? Examples of local councillors speaking to guilds women included Ellen Wilkinson on what use have women made of the vote. These kind of cross-organisational conversations are perhaps to be expected. All these women were part of the wider Labour movement. Moreover, the fact that Labour women such as Anna Robinson were speaking on housing, education and municipal control of milk says a great deal about the kind of issues which would connect the woman in the home and the public authority, to use Mitchell's words. However, other women councillors who were not identified with Labour were also invited to speak at guild meetings. As Councillor Jane Redford, who was an independent, she spoke to Levenshulme Women's Cooperative Guild on the work of a city councillor. Certainly in the early 1920s, there was a real sense that women might have shared interests in relation to municipal affairs, and that whatever their individual party affiliations, developing the new woman citizen was paramount. But making a bridge between the woman in the home and the public authority, let alone interpreting one to the other, was more difficult. Now, one way to do this was to explore the terrain of everyday life. Instead of seeing the banality of daily life as separate from and unconnected to politics, some women saw it as having the potential to mobilise women in new ways. It's significant that when the Labour Party women's organiser for the North West, Mary Anderson, remembered the first general election in which women could vote, she of course celebrated Labour's success and linked this to women's new voting power. However, her narrative then continued. She said, "The end of our women's first adventure into parliamentary politics over, in the North West we turned to the ordinary everyday affairs of life." Now for her this meant two things. First, there was the issue of how women did politics. She explained, and this is a quote, "The political propaganda of the cotton districts is mainly done in the mills, or on the way to and from the mills. And for when the day's work is finished in the mill, the women have to begin their domestic duties of baking, washing, and household cleaning. This does not leave much leisure time for meetings, and one has to be very enthusiastic to find time for political work. These circumstances also determine the attitude of mind which demands very practical use of the limited leisure available." Now, secondly, Anderson argued that the turn to ordinary everyday affairs also sat at the core of these women's political concerns. And she saw these as being safer maternity, better and more convenient houses, and a happier childhood for our boys and girls. The everyday and the domestic was one way in which many of the first generation of Manchester women's city councillors connected with their local communities. Indeed, being rooted in a local community was crucial to the way in which these women presented themselves to the voters. Edith Chilton, a councillor, made this point to the electorate in Hume, that she knew the area well as she had begun to earn her living at 10, delivering newspapers locally. The woman citizen said of her, "Her strength of character and ability to gain and hold the respect of the people who have known her from childhood is responsible for this attainment," i.e. getting elected, while her intimate knowledge of the needs and the conditions of this congested area is invaluable in her work. Now, such a local base was not unusual. For others, it was not just that they knew the neighbourhoods where they made their politics, but that they shared the experiences of those around them. So when Mrs. Harrison stood in the Cheetham ward, she emphasised that if she was elected, she would vote solidly for direct Labour. She explained that this was because she had lived in a corporation house that had been badly built by contractors, and she now lived in one with considerably superior workmanship that had been built by direct Labour, and she wanted to ensure that others benefited from her experience. Similarly, the Woman Citizen reported that Councillor Edith Chilton, quote, laughingly remarked that she doubted if any member of the Council's Baths and Washhouses Committee had served a better apprenticeship to the wash tub than she had. Certainly no member has shown a keener interest, said the Woman Citizen, than Mrs. Chilton in getting the latest labour-saving devices installed in our public washhouses in order to lessen the labour of those who use them. Remaining a part of the neighbourhood had a practical as well as a political dimension for many of these women. It was from their neighbours that the necessary domestic support often came to enable women to be activists and elected representatives. As Hannah Mitchell remembered gratefully, "I could write a book on the good neighbours who have helped to make so much of my life." Balancing the domestic requirements to sustain daily life with the demands of political activism was a challenge for the first generation of women municipal candidates, particularly for local Labour women in Manchester who were generally working class. A number of the most active Labour women in the city were single, such as Annie Lee, or they had a grown-up family, such as Hannah Mitchell and Edith Chilton. This did not solve the problem, but it could ease it. In 1926, the Woman Citizen commented, "The reconciliation of public and private responsibilities is made easy for Mrs. Chilton by the sympathetic interest her husband and 2 grown-up sons take in her work, which they show in very practical ways, such as arranging to have their midday meal out 4 days out of 7. For others, it was not so clear that they would reconcile these responsibilities if elected. For example, Dora Taylor first stood for the council when her son was 5 years old, while Josephine Shaw's daughter was only 1 year older at her first contest. Hannah Mitchell, as usual, made a political point over the whole issue. She said, "In regard to the claims of home versus public work, Mrs. Mitchell believes that while a woman's first duty is to her home and family, that is not her whole duty. She finds by adopting labour-saving devices and being methodical, it is possible to run her home and carry on her public work. Fortunately, her husband is sufficiently sympathetic and public-spirited to realise that it is possible to eat a meal without his wife sitting by to sweep his teeth. And a friend is always ready to prepare a meal or help in other ways as her contribution to the general good." One way or another, domestic life had to be attended to. The accepted sexual division of labour ensured that daily domestic labour, housework, shopping for and preparing meals, washing clothes, were invariably women's responsibility. Indeed, Marion Phillips, Chief Women's Officer of the Labour Party, commented in 1923 as the membership prepared for a general election. She said, "It is so important that the proudest housewives can afford to let their housework slide a little for the weeks of the general election. The house-proud woman will realise that it is better to have a government which stands for health, housing and education and peace, rather than to have her brasses polished and her floors scrubbed and everything spick and span for the short term. A woman's work is never done, so it can always be postponed. It is striking that the longest lasting column in the monthly magazine Labour Woman was titled The Housewife. Across the 1920s, the purpose of this column varied. Pieces reporting on activism around food and exhortations to vote Labour in order to improve the conditions of the daily struggle of the housewife jostled for space with recipes and domestic hints. There seemed to be an uncertainty about whether the housewife should be addressed as someone whose world was circumscribed and whose interests were only concerned with the home, who was a passive audience for political propaganda rather than having a voice of her own. In the 1920s, the memory was still fresh of how the wartime politics of food, particularly its scarcity, had provided the focus for some political women to galvanise housewives into activity within their local neighbourhoods. This had been an example of how an issue which had previously been understood as a women's issue, but not as a political matter, food, had in the wartime emergency quickly become politicised, but in a fascinating way, but not for today, had at the same time ceased to be seen as a gendered matter. So, quite an interesting problematic. The interwar period saw a considerable debate on a long-standing issue. Were there women's issues of special or even only of interest to women? If there were women's issues, did their association with women isolate them from the real business of politics? There was already recognition amongst some of the first generation of women councillors that politics was gendered, and much that mattered to women was marginal to the agenda of national and to local politics. Margaret Ashton observed early in her career on Manchester City Council. She said matters of great importance to women had been overlooked, not because men desired to neglect them, but because they never thought of them. Many women had, of course, made the case for women's enfranchisement precisely on the grounds that they would bring a different and complementary set of interests and concerns into politics once they became citizens. The ideology of separate spheres which had kept women confined to the domestic sphere would be the means to argue for women's expertise, particularly in matters associated with local government, such as education and welfare. By the interwar period, it looked to some that middle-class women were beginning to make a case to speak on behalf of women on the grounds of their shared interests, while many ordinary women remained imprisoned in the daily grind of domesticity. Increasingly, the issue was how to connect the few activist women with their unorganised or indifferent sisters. And central to this was how to see everyday domesticity. Now, some already saw the notion of the domestic as having a much wider resonance. An example is a regular column headed Domestic in North Bristol Labour's paper Bristol Forward. Here, women wrote articles on aspects of women's politics, such as local government, education, or peace, rather than on domestic matters. Their aim was to ensure that women voters should realise that politics touches the home life at all points. As soon as she rises in the morning and strikes a match to light the fire, she is taxed. When she makes her tea for breakfast, again, she is taxed. Taxes are imposed by the government, and she has to pay whether she likes it or not. And that's politics. Now, there was a fine line to be drawn on whether the notion of women's issues and separate spaces for women, such as women's sections, was actually a patronising one. In 1928, one Labour woman expressed her view on this, that the ordinary woman she felt, well, what she was commenting was this idea that the ordinary woman must have a special appeal made to her to bring her into the movement. And she rather mocked the approach, which she assumes, and these are her words, if you are to have a woman's support, you must put up a sign for ladies only. And having thus destroyed her shyness, you must offer her the pill of Labour politics, nicely disguised in a jam made of baby talks, clothes talks, with perhaps a little scandal and a tea party thrown in. In a word, she went on, women themselves conspire to treat their own sex as just a little childish, just a little below the standard of the average man who can presumably take big, bold chunks of political economy, history or psychology as easily as he can take his beer. Now here the suggestion is that assumptions are made about what will make politics palatable to women, while elsewhere there continue to be debates about whether special women's pages were needed in party newspapers and whether a domestic focus was essential to win women's interest. In a period traditionally characterised by a return to domesticity, the figure of the housewife was often evoked by politicians, but her experience as a potential political force in the 1920s and 30s has rarely been interrogated. Hannah Mitchell, in her journalism and in her political practice in Manchester in the 1920s, often addressed the housewife, but hers was not a conservative with a small c message. Her argument that no section of the community is more closely affected by the methods adopted by our local governing bodies than the woman in the home was not that unusual a view or even that radical. The same could be said of her observation that the work of the city council, quote, bears some analogy to the work of the women in the home, a sort of larger housekeeping. Yet her emphasis on discussions on the unemployed, on how women are never seen as unemployed, and how there is no drive to limit the housewife's working week, was much more challenging. She consistently emphasised how women's daily lives were affected by politics, such as in an article where she explored the links between election day and washing day. In this, I think, clever piece, she managed to show to women readers that she knew exactly what washing day meant to working class women, because it was her experience too. She provides a detailed description of the exhausting physical demands that washing day meant, particularly if this was also election day. And this is just an extract. All the white articles must be soaked and rubbed through 2 tubs of water, then boiled, rinsed and starched. The coloured things separately according to colour, rubbed, rinsed, starched and wrung out. Each article must pass 3 or 4 times through the hands of the washer. Then comes the drying in a sooty back street if the rain has ceased. If not, round the fire in the living room or on a rack suspended from the ceiling with the whole atmosphere full of soap-flavoured steam. Folding, mangling and ironing by hand will take 3 or 4 hours, and by this time it may be 9 o'clock in the evening, and if it happens to be election day, the poll is closed. So how did she think any connection could be made with this isolated figure in the home? Well, writing as Councillor Mrs. H.M. Mitchell, and that's not unimportant, she goes on to say that if a canvasser were to ask the woman to leave her washing and come and vote, the woman would probably answer, "What good will it be to me? They won't do any washing for me, whoever gets in." And now we hear Councillor Hannah Mitchell's voice, for she goes on to say, "Not do her washing indeed. Why? Given a council of men and women with vision, we could make life a heaven on earth for the housewife, instead of the veritable hell it so often is. We could give her a well-built, well-equipped house. We could nurse her babies as well as teach them. We could heal the sick and minister to mind as well as body. All this we could do if we could make men and women see how closely their daily lives are affected by politics." Hannah Mitchell then pushed home her political point. No time for bothering with politics, the housewife says, and consequently she has no time for anything else. The connection between washing day and election day may not at first seem very obvious, but think again, slave of the tub. The way your vote is cast decides whether or not you have a wash house, school, library, or whatever you want. So on election day, down washing tools and vote for more public wash houses. So for Hannah Mitchell, the home was a space which not only was affected by politics, but out of which a new form of politics might emerge. Domesticity did not need to be conservative or confining, but according to Mitchell, it had to be addressed. This meant that what had been assumed to be private had to become public. The content of interwar women's politics is largely about debates between women across and between political organisations on how to translate women's issues into political issues. And that meant, in the changing climate of local and national politics, increasingly into party politics. How do you do that while I'm talking? Women's issues were not just those that related to the welfare of women as mothers and to their children, although many were or were figured in this way, such as peace. The interwar era saw new women's issues cohere and seek space on the wider political agenda. For example, women campaigned to get housing recognised as a party political issue, which should be given priority on local municipal agendas. They claimed that women were experts in housing since the home was their workplace, and therefore they argued that women should be central to the drafting of housing policy and to the designing of public housing. They used the full spectrum of women's political spaces to make this case, and also to link their activities with those of the unorganised housewife, and to connect everyday life with women's politics. Yet at the same time, what was understood as political was being stretched and reconfigured. Most organised women argued that housing was a woman's issue and that political organisations ought to have a policy on it. They often didn't. Yet issues which galvanised women into action across party and organisational boundaries could be understood differently. And one example is Manchester's Maternal Mortality Committee, set up as a consequence of the Molly Taylor case in May 1934. Mrs. Taylor, a healthy 19-year-old, was turned away from St Mary's Hospital when she arrived already in labour. She gave birth on the steps of the hospital and then was taken on a difficult journey by ambulance across set paved streets to the former workhouse hospital in North Manchester in Crumpsall. Although the child survived, his young mother died the following day. The uproar in the city led eventually to a public inquiry and a wider campaign for safe motherhood in the city, led by a cross-party maternal mortality committee. And this committee was later remembered by the secretary of the local Labour Women's Advisory Council as not political. It was concerned, she said, with women, irrespective of any kind of politics. We were concerned with the reduction of the death rate amongst pregnant women and babies. In contrast, a leading woman Conservative councillor at the time remembered this same committee rather differently. I don't think, she said, they did an awful lot. They were more political than they were childcare. I was really interested in women of the district. They were interested in party politics. The paradox of the interwar period is that it saw a huge increase in women's membership of political parties. But at the same time, women's organisations became increasingly wary of anything they deemed political, by which they meant party politics. In this, there were clear continuities with the earlier suffragist tradition of being non-party, and the increasing frustration of suffragists and suffragettes with Edwardian party politics. So, in conclusion, you'll be pleased to hear. In conclusion, under this picture of a municipal wash house, what I hope I have suggested to you is how the story of interwar women's politics could be reframed by refocusing on the local, to explore the nature of women's networks, how women negotiated multiple and changing affiliations, and the interrelationship between women's organisations and other political organisations and pressure groups. Instead of compartmentalising women's experience in the parallel histories of particular parties or movements or organisations, women's politics should be seen as something which happens in a range of spaces. The connections between women's experiences of formal and informal politics in the interwar period allow us to foreground the extent to which the creation of a new female electorate made a difference to the practice and experience of politics in women's daily lives. It's in order to develop this further that we're suggesting this new archaeology of women's politics. It's going to place the interrelationship between the possible spaces for everyday politics that individual women identified with, combined, moved through, or even rejected. So it's going to look at those spaces within the context of the changing politics of the time. Equally important will be to recognise the role of preceding political cultures and experiences in shaping the possibilities for a women's politics in the aftermath of suffrage. The creation of this archaeology of women's politics poses challenges for how we explain what happened after the vote was won, but also of how we conceive of politics more generally. Now, I'm not claiming that stories of women's politics can only be told when anchored within local political cultures. But without this, I think we only have a partial, a patchy, and even a distorted national picture. The national story of women's politics will change when it's rebuilt out from the neighbourhood, from the local and the everyday. For our understanding of women's politics to be meaningful, it can live in fragments no longer. Remember that original phrase. And that is why, along with E.M. Forster, I think our watchword should be, all together, only connect. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Karen. Karen has kindly agreed to take questions and comments, and I'm sure that you will have many to offer. So can I open it up to everyone, please?
You said that the Labour candidates were working class. What kind of education had they had? And what was the difference between the middle class and the working class women in local politics?
Right. They have quite varied backgrounds. I mean, someone like Ellen Wilkinson goes to university, even though she comes from very much a working class background. Indeed, and one of the reasons I know that is when I was a student at Manchester University, I was awarded an award which lasted me for a matter of months, and which basically kept Ellen Wilkinson going through the whole of her university career. I can't now remember what it was called, but anyway, I was told that story at the time. But I mean, she's an example of the kind of younger generation. Well, Anna Robinson was also a graduate, actually. And she's an interesting example of someone sinking through the sort of social scales as partly through the man she married, who was from a working class background, but also turned out to be a rather unreliable breadwinner. And so she had to find ways to support her family herself. For others, we're talking about a similar education to their compatriots, so that's leaving school at 14. A number of the women I mentioned get their, as it were, additional education through becoming trade union activists. And indeed are paid organisers for trade unions. That's one of the ways that they earn a living. So education is something that makes them different from middle class councillors, but what I think is interesting actually is that in that first generation, even some of the Conservative councillors are also from a working class background. So there's much more of a kind of sense of their identification with their neighbourhoods and a kind of shared background, but then a very different interpretation of what you do about that background and how you act as a councillor and what politics that creates for you. So they aren't always what you expect them to be. And they're pioneers, and we should look carefully at both where they come from, but also then how they develop.
Any other questions or comments? Fiona and then...
Thank you, Karen. I was just thinking that for men seeking some kind of political activity or political legitimacy in this period, it would have been really important to state their war record. The chap who'd had the war was much more likely to get voted for than anyone else. In fact, men who'd been conscientious objectors weren't even allowed to vote. So I'm wondering if this attempt to focus on the local and on very particular humanitarian issues, because women are having to search for something that is not the good war, because they won't have been able to have the same war experience.
That's interesting, because someone like Anna Robinson and the other women who were active during the war, in opposition to the war, it's precisely because they are connecting with women who are being displaced from their work because of the changes that happens in employment because of the war, and the new work conditions and so on. And what they want to make sure is that their working conditions are as good as they can be, and so on. So their notion of the war is very different, and it actually becomes a way that they keep on. I mean, they are already connecting, but they start making new connections, and that way in which those women's experience of the home front actually then shapes their post-war politics is something that I think is a story that isn't told much, and starts to give you a different perspective. But we shouldn't then think that they're not having to make statements about their war experience, because Margaret Ashton, who is the first woman councillor in Manchester, and was venerated to begin with. She is against the war as well, and when it came to the time to celebrate, I think it was her 70th birthday, a portrait was painted of her to be hung in the council room alongside all the men, and the council refused to take the portrait because she had been against the war. And the portrait then disappeared, and many years later we found it in the basement of Manchester City Art Gallery, and it was restored, and we've now had it rehung, so she is now restored to her rightful place amongst the men. But she suffered. She was taken off committees because of her pacifism. So you're right that there are all sorts of issues, and the left, because the left is split over the war, there are then issues about actually maybe you want someone who is against the war, and then other people don't. Whether that means that therefore you look to the domestic, I'm not sure that it's quite as. I can't see that through someone like Hannah Mitchell. I don't think that's apparent. It may be. I certainly think for the way in which, say, the Conservative Party, which tries to exploit this issue in terms of the way it relates to women, it might work for that kind of approach. For the examples that I've given to you, I suspect it doesn't work so well. But worth thinking about. Thank you.
There's quite a bit of evidence of men being galvanised into campaigning through attending classes with the Workers' Education Association. I just wondered if there is a similar parallel with women going to these classes. For example, there's a village just outside of Diga where the people going to a WEA class actually got running water, got the roads done, got a village hall, all because they went to a WEA class, which I think is absolutely great.
Well, certainly the WEA, along with other similar sorts of, I suppose, student-controlled education, was very important, I think, in forming a number of these women activists. And I would put, I think the WEA is important, and I used to work for the WEA, so I kind of, have to sort of wave a flag for it, even if I was the last women's education tutor organiser they employed. But anyway, but I think also important was one of the slides, the Women's Cooperative Guild, because the Guild is one of the places which, in a sense, brings that together for women in particular. And it was seen as a space, particularly for housewives, of working men, to be somewhere where, you know, you could, in a sense, you could take all sorts of journeys through self-education, many of which were very deliberately inflected with politics with a small p. And one of the things that's quite interesting in the interwar period is that there are, I think, that quite a few political parties begin to see the Guild as a kind of good way to reach women who are potentially and actually political. So there's an interesting little side fight going on in the Guild about whether communist women can be involved in it. So there's a lot going on there, but the key about education, self-education, particularly the idea that your education is one that you devise and control yourself, that it's not about access to, as it were, bourgeois education, is something that had been very important before the war, First World War, but then continues into the interwar period as well. So, I mean, I think you're right, although I haven't yet found as good an example as you've got.
Are there any further questions or comments? If not, could I ask Helen to come and give a vote of thanks?
To go away.
Thank you. I'd just like to say, well, obviously, first of all, thank you to Karen for a fascinating lecture. The really interesting thing for me coming out of the lecture was having spent a week where I've been dealing with politicians at national level, seeing how women's approach to politics at the time was so practical and outcomes focused, which is a horrible modern sort of jargonistic thing, but it's so important. We talk a lot about the process of things like devolution, and the focus really needs to be on outcomes. And these women were really so focused on achieving a better life chances for their neighbours and their friends and their colleagues. So, yeah, absolutely fascinating. So thank you, Karen, for that. My aunt Ursula would have found this absolutely fascinating. She spent her whole academic career researching and highlighting the role of women in politics and in society. And one of the reasons we were very keen to sponsor this lecture is because remembering women's roles and what they've done and how they've achieved what they've achieved is so important. And I like to think that we're doing our bit by keeping this lecture going to remember the work that Ursula did and how important that work was. So hopefully I'll see you all again here next year.